Hi friends, welcome back to another video. I apologize that the lighting is absolutely terrible today, but we're just gonna work with it. Today I'm gonna be talking through all the books that I read in January, and I apologize that this is coming late. Our family has been battling the flu, and it hit me especially hard. It's taken me about 2 weeks to really feel like myself again. And even now, I still have a lot of congestion and coughing. Hopefully that won't get too much in the way today. Either way, the show must go on, and I'm really excited to talk through these books with you. I'm going to start with one that I read every winter, and that is Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is a book that I did not read as a child, but I read it a few years ago when I was actually living in Wisconsin, and it was an especially snowy day, and I remember sitting by my window. We lived in a wooded area, and there were deer outside, and it was so peaceful. And I read these stories about Laura and her family in the big woods of Wisconsin. Many of the stories take place during the winter, and it truly helped me romanticize winter for the first time in my life. These stories are so charming and so cozy, and if you haven't read it before, I highly recommend that you do, especially in the wintertime. I love the slower pace of Laura and her family, and something that stood out to me the first time I read this was the simple joys that Laura and her family found. Even though they didn't necessarily have a lot, they worked for what they had and they appreciated everything. And I think with how much variety and choices we have today, we could certainly learn a lesson about gratitude and appreciating what we have from stories like this. I haven't read this whole series, but this is one in particular that I just like to read over and over again. And I loved it just as much this time as I did the first time I read it. I'm going to move into another children's classic that I read this month, and that is The House at Pooh Corner by A.A. Milne. Now, my mom is a huge Winnie the Pooh fan, especially Disney's Pooh. And so I just grew up loving Pooh, watching all of the Pooh movies and TV shows. But I had never really read the classic stories about Pooh. A lot of these stories do show up in the TV and film adaptations from Disney, but there's something really special about reading the actual source material. This is the second book in the Pooh collection by A.A. Milne, and I have pretty much the same feelings about this one that I do about the first, which is mostly that it's incredibly charming, incredibly funny, and just a true joy. If you've never read these books as an adult, I highly recommend that you do. They are filled with so many puns and other plays on words. Obviously, these animals are the stuffed animals of Christopher Robin, but it's so funny to see them learn and misunderstand things. The characters are flawed but incredibly lovable, and I love seeing them try to get themselves out of sticky situations. Their problem solving is incredibly entertaining. And especially in this book, I love the themes of sacrifice and growing up. I had to give this 5 out of 5 stars. And apparently this was the month of children's classics because I also read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This was a reread for me, but I haven't read it since college, I think. Probably early college. I actually tried to finish this on New Year's Eve, but I didn't quite get to it, so it's made its way into my January wrap-up. This book is really special to me because I have strong memories of my dad reading it to me when I was a kid. I read it again in elementary school for a book report, but when I think back to when I last read it, it's been at least 10 years. But this is a story that I associate with wintertime for very obvious reasons, and I just felt like it was time for a reread. Reading this now as a grown woman who is able to read with a more critical eye and having read more broadly and just knowing more about C.S. Lewis in general, I have to say I still absolutely love the story. Maybe now more than ever. This book is incredibly enchanting, and I love the way that Lewis really invites the reader into the story. He breaks the fourth wall a number of times, and honestly, that's something that I really love in children's literature. This was perfect for the Christmas and winter season, and I do really want to continue reading this series throughout the year of 2025. The last time I read it was in chronological order, which is how most sets come these days, but that's actually not publication order, and I think I'd really like to read it in publication order this time around. Anyway, if you've never read it, or if you haven't read it for a long time, I think now is a great time to read it again. This story really is so special, and there's a reason that it stood the test of time. I don't think I could ever give this fewer than 5 stars. Alright, I have 2 more stories to share with you, and they are both adult fantasies. I'm going to start with the one that I read for my 25 and 25 book challenge, and that is The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin. This one did take me some time to get through. It's 450 pages, which actually isn't too bad, but I will say this book was very intimidating to me. But I knew that a lot of people love this story, and I was up for the challenge, and I will say that my patience was rewarded. This book won the Hugo Award in 2016, and the other 2 books in the trilogy also won the Hugo Award, which I think says a lot about its merit. And this book was such a fun ride. It did take me time to get grounded in the world. This book is about a woman who finds her son dead and her daughter missing, and she believes that her husband is to blame. So she sets off to go try to find her daughter, and this all takes place in an apocalyptic setting. What I didn't realize was that this book follows multiple perspectives over different periods of time. That ended up being exactly what this story needed, and it really helped me gain a broader view of not only the magic, but the world. But I will say that that is part of the reason that it took me some time to get into the story. I was trying to remember the different characters and their different settings. Once you start to get settled, you really start to get invested. I'll also say that you are not told a lot. You are shown over time what is going on, and that really makes the story exciting. Normally, that's something that is kind of hard for me. I just want to understand and make sense of everything. But the process of trying to figure everything out is really enjoyable and very rewarding. Once the pieces begin to come together, you see just how well the story is told and how great the magic system is. Again, it's hard to figure out, and I'm still figuring it out, but that makes for a really nice reading experience, honestly. I also enjoyed the way that the author slowly revealed more about the characters to us. You can feel like you figured them out, and then suddenly you find more depth to them. The world itself was really interesting too. And like I said, the multiple POVs really lended itself to discovering the world by showing you different cultures and different geography, different classes even, and it's really fascinating. I don't want to give away too much about this story, but I think something that I would have liked to know going in was a little bit more about the magic. I don't want to give away too much because, again, so much of the enjoyment of this story for me was figuring out how everything worked. But I especially loved how unique this magic system was. The magic in this world really draws on the earth, and the people who can practice this magic are able to tap into the ground and draw energy from the earth itself. They can feel the fault lines, they can calm tremors, and that's only the most basic part of it. It's really cool. There was so much revealed in just this first book, but yeah, I still have so many questions about the magic and the world and the characters. I think there's still so much to discover, and I definitely want to continue on with this trilogy. I completely understand why it has gotten so much praise and accolades. This was definitely 5 stars. The last book that I want to share is a book that my book club chose to read for the month of January, and that is Phantasma by Kaylee Smith. And this book, this was one of the options for book of the month, and I remember reading about it, and it said something like, this is really gruesome and not for the faint of heart. And I remember thinking, maybe that's gonna be too much for me. But the premise of it sounded so intriguing, so I just waited to make my decision. And then I went to Barnes & Noble, and I saw the book on a table, and I was like, okay, this book is still in my brain, and I'm still very intrigued by it. I think that I have to read it. So I went ahead and ordered it, and I'm honestly so glad that I made that decision. This is a horror fantasy romance. And to be honest, I don't really read horror. I'm interested, but I'm also kind of scaredy cat, so I just haven't read very much. I do like fantasy and romance though. The book had spooky vibes, and it had a competition, so I thought I'd probably like it. This story follows Ophelia, who is a necromancer. When her mom dies suddenly, she gains her mother's powers and also, unfortunately, her mother's debt. She and her sister are about to lose their ancestral home, and during a fight, Ophelia's sister runs off, claiming that she can take care of everything. When Genevieve does not come home, Ophelia starts to get worried, and she begins digging around and learns that Genevieve is really obsessed with this competition called Phantasma, which just happens to have arrived in their city. Phantasma, also called the Devil's House, is a competition full of horror and life and death situations. The last person standing wins a devil's favor, which is basically any wish that they want to be granted. The contestants travel through different levels, which are inspired by Dante's Inferno, and you can only leave if you forfeit in between levels, but most people do not make it out alive. Ophelia decides that in order to protect her sister, she must also enter this competition and find her, convincing her to forfeit. Along the way, she meets a phantom named Blackwell, who agrees to help her survive if she will help him break the curse that is tying him to the house forever. This book was such a pleasant surprise for me. I will note right away that there is a lot of spice in this book, a lot of open door scenes that are very explicit, and personally, I felt like there was a little too much. At one point, I got to another scene and I was like, really? Again? And I know that's a personal preference, but thankfully there was so much else in the story, and really you could skip those scenes if you want to. I do think the story is worth reading aside from all of that. I really loved the story. I was completely hooked. I loved the competition element. That's something that personally I really enjoy in a story. I liked the writing itself. I liked that there were multiple layers to the story. At first I thought the horror was going to be a little too much, and I tried not to visualize certain scenes because I didn't want to get freaked out, but it did tame down quite a bit as the book continued on. There is a lot of violence, and the characters are put in very high stakes situations, so that could be a little intense for you, but personally I thought it was okay. I found it really interesting to see how the author created the different trials based on the 9 circles of hell, and I loved the other storylines that were woven throughout. I liked the romance. I liked the way that Ophelia fought her personal demons throughout the story. I liked seeing our main character search for answers about her sister and her mother. I liked learning about the Phantom and his own story. And the house itself was really interesting too. Truly, I never felt bored reading the story. This was almost 500 pages, but it felt so quick. The ending wrapped up maybe a little too perfectly, but I still enjoyed it. And I do think there were some points where I started to predict what was going to happen, but the revelations at the end were still satisfying to me. All in all, I really love this book. I gave it 4.5 stars rounded up. All right. That is everything that I read in January. I read 5 books, but I also started a few that I didn't quite finish, so those are going to be in my February wrap-up. Obviously, we're like halfway through the month at this point, but I can already tell you I'm excited to talk about those books. Anyway, if you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. I'd love to know what you read in January, and specifically what was your favorite book that you read in January. I love all of your recommendations, and I'd love to chat more about these particular books with you. And of course, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to hear more from me in the future, go ahead and hit subscribe. As always, I love you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.